Good morning. Good morning. Hi. Welcome to this session on the global trade order and future prospects. My name is Terry Martin. The global trade order is being reshaped in real time. Geopolitical rivalries, tariff wars, and the rise of digital platforms are rewriting the rules of the way economies connect. What used to look like steady globalization is now a contested and shifting battlefield. To help us make sense of all this, we've got a couple of where things might be going, because again, it's not just where things are now, but where things are headed. That's very much what this conference is about, navigating where we are heading. And we've got a couple of people here who have a really good sense of where things may be going from a global perspective, which includes very much the United States, and in this case as well, Korea. It's my great pleasure to introduce, first of all, Minister YEO Han-koo, South Korea's trade minister, with firsthand experience negotiating at the sharp edge of U.S. protectionism. He'll tell us more about that in just a moment. And Professor Hal Brands, one of the foremost thinkers linking trade and security in this turbulent world. Together, they'll help us explore the whole question of where the world trade order is going. So now we're going to dive into what I had prepared together with our speakers for today, because this development, of course, in the United States is still ongoing, and it's capturing a lot of attention. But there's a background to this. The background is that a recent agreement was made, trade agreement was reached, tariff agreement with the United States, which involved a lot of Korean investment that was just announced recently. So I think with that background, that made the shock of these detentions all the greater. And I wanted to ask you, Minister YEO, about that. You, obviously, as trade minister for Korea, played a fundamental role in negotiating that agreement. It's a major tariff agreement with President Trump in the United States. I wanted to ask you what that negotiation was like, and what was the most difficult part of that negotiation?
Obviously, it was not an easy process for Korea because I think there were, the difficulties in particular on both sides. First, on the Korea side, Korea was late in the game. We've gone through this political turmoil because of this, the martial law and impeachment, etc. So when this new administration came into power, actually I was appointed in less than a week, after the new government came in. And then in my second week, I was in DC, meeting with my counterpart, the USTR Korea, and also Secretary Lutnick as well. But already many of other countries' negotiation were, progress way ahead of Korea. So actually, by the time when Korea was ready to really accelerate this negotiation, I think already Japan got a deal and the European Union got a deal. So Korea was actually under a lot of pressure as a latecomer to really find out the best deal for Korea. So that was on the Korean part, and then on the US part. I've gone through the first Trump administration. At that time, renegotiating this Korea-US free trade agreement at that time. But I think right now, this time around, is very, very different from Trump 1 as well. During the first Trump administration, actually, I think the dynamics and the structure on the US side was much simpler, And at that time, we had this, the Section 232 steel tariff and many other threats of new tariff, but actually only steel 232 tariff. And I think this safeguard measures on the washing machine, that was actually just the only new tariff put in place. But now I think it's almost like more than 100 times of tariff in terms of scope and magnitude. And also during the first Trump administration, I think USTR played a central role. So we needed to only negotiate with the USTR, then we are done. But right now, there are multiple players right now. You have to talk with USTR and also Commerce and sometimes Treasury. So I think it's a much more complicated and dynamic landscape right now that we have to deal with.
Hal, South Korea is an important ally for the United States in this part of the world. There's a long-standing relationship between these two countries, also a trading relationship. Help us understand the political significance of the tariffs that Trump has been imposing also on allies.
Well, I think the word that you mentioned there, allies, is really the key, because one of the ways in which the Trump administration is different than a lot of prior U.S. administrations, and certainly different from the Biden administration, is that President Trump doesn't think of the world in terms of allies and adversaries as the United States has typically thought of them. And in fact, in his mind, it is U.S. allies that have often taken advantage of the United States and exploited the United States. And he looks at, and I'm not advocating this here, I'm just trying to explain how President Trump, I think, sees it. He looks at unbalanced trade relationships and unbalanced alliances as two sides of the same whole. And so when he looks at U.S. relations with Germany or other European countries, or U.S. relations with Japan or South Korea, what he sees are countries that are exploiting access to the American market, in his view, and that are exploiting American military power and military protection so they can underspend on their own militaries. I think there is a lot to contest in that view. There's a lot one can argue about, and I certainly would argue with some of the remedies that the president has proposed for that problem. But I think that's a faithful rendering of how he sees the international environment. And it creates a lot of dissonance in the world because countries with whom the United States has had long-standing security relationships in many cases expect or hope, understandably, to be treated better than countries who straddle the geopolitical divide or may end up on the opposite side of it. And that happens only imperfectly in the Trump administration. And then I would just sort of echo a point that the minister made, which is that it's a much more complicated negotiating environment for American trade partners this time around, in part because there is so much less reliable process in this administration on policy issues than there was in Trump 1. In Trump 1, for at least significant parts of the administration, there was something that resembled a normal policy process on the national security side, on the economic side as well. This time, there's a lot more sort of freewheeling by the president himself. There's a lot more of having various advisors who are sort of trying to interpret the president's wishes based on an imperfect understanding of exactly what he wants. And I think it's made it difficult in many cases for U.S. trade partners to even understand what it is the United States is seeking in some of these negotiations.
I can see that. Okay. We've talked in very broad terms and a little bit about the negotiating experience of coming up with this tariff agreement, which was difficult. I wanted to ask you, Minister Yeo, about a very specific part of that deal, the word Trump's favorite word. Talk to us about MASGA. MASGA, this is a key part of Korea's negotiation strategy with the U.S. It stands for Make American Shipbuilding Great Again. And Donald Trump also praised the shipbuilding strengths of South Korea, recognizing how it can make a contribution. But this was a significant deal. We're talking about, it involved, I think, $150 billion of investment by South Korean shipbuilders into the United States maritime sector, trying to sweeten the tariffs deal with Trump. The offer was designed to avert even bigger tariffs than South Korea is already dealing with. It seems to have gone down well. How did you come up with that, and how does it fit into Korea's core strategy towards the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think Korea's core strategy approaching this negotiation was that we try to see the big picture. It's not just about tariff negotiation, but this is about kind of developing new sort of a strategy for industrial and economic cooperation for the next 4 or 5 years. between two countries. And in that sense, we saw that manufacturing Renaissance partnership is a key win-win proposition for both countries. But because, as I mentioned, U.S. need partner to rebuild the manufacturing, and this is an area where Korea can offer a lot, can make a difference to our U.S. partners, right? And so in that sense, already many Korean companies are investing in semiconductor, batteries, EV, and etc. But especially shipbuilding is exactly the area where only Korea can make a difference to our U.S. partners. But because we all know that the U.S. right now is much far behind many of these strategic competitors in Asia, and but Korea is the number 2 after China in terms of the shipbuilding capabilities. So we sort of developed this idea of make America shipbuilding great again by forging this strategic partnership between these two. I think there are two components from the U.S. perspective. They need to kind of secure the more military ship as well as commercial ship as soon as possible. So filling the gap is number one. Number two, in the process also, they want to rebuild this industrial base, right? So by forging this partnership between this Korean shipyard and then U.S. shipyard, for example, Philly shipyard that a Korean company had acquired, by coordinating and kind of combining these the shipyard in both countries, we can achieve these two objectives. Building these necessary ships as soon as possible for the U.S. Navy or U.S. commercial partners, and also in the process slowly begin to rebuild this U.S. industrial base. But in order to do that, we need workers, right? Workers, and also we need steel. We need a lot of these components, intermediate good. So that is why also it is very, very important for the U.S. government to do this kind of streamline all this regulation, kind of blocking this development of this shipbuilding industry in the U.S.
Hal, I think you want to respond to that. And maybe when you're responding, maybe you could also kind of cast your gaze ahead of where you see this tariff policy going in the U.S., this protectionist tendency.
Well, I think just to put sort of a larger frame on the minister's comments, with which I wholly agree, when you look at this from a national security perspective, there are a variety of critical military and security needs that the United States will only be able to satisfy through deeper industrial integration with its allies. That's true if you're thinking about building icebreakers, where the United States is going to need help from Scandinavian countries. It's true if you think about shipbuilding, where Korea and Japan are going to play a very important role. It's true if you think about building new nuclear attack submarines with Great Britain and Australia. It's true if you think about building drones and jet engines and a variety of other things the United States might do with India in the coming years. The only way to sort of create greater security and greater military resilience in what we might think of as the free world or the democratic world is to achieve a much deeper integration of those industrial and technological development capabilities. And so the stakes of this are very high, even going beyond the U.S.-Korea relationship, as important as that relationship is. With respect to the tariffs, I think it's important to differentiate between trends that are sort of part of the American political landscape and then trends that are more idiosyncratic or more particular to this administration and this president. The U.S. has been turning away from sort of the high tide of free trade for about 15 years now. This is a bipartisan phenomenon. You only have to go back to the fact that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump disavowed the Trans-Pacific Partnership when they were running for president in 2015. The Obama administration was ambivalent about new trade agreements and so on and so forth. And so there is sort of this longer running sense of dislocation and disillusion with free trade that I think is somewhat misplaced, because if you look at what actually is has sort of decreased manufacturing employment in the United States. It has as much, if not much more, to do with automation and other technological trends than it does with trade. But nonetheless, that is sort of a fixture of the American political landscape. So regardless of who is elected in 2028 or 2032, we're not going back to the days of the 1990s anytime soon. That said, there's a reason that Trump refers to himself as tariff man, because he is sort of consumed with tariffs in a way that I think is not true of virtually any other major actor in the American political system. He views tariffs through his own political lens. He views it through his own economic lens. He has this sense of American greatness that's very much rooted in sort of an 1890s approach to foreign policy. We're emphasizing territorial expansion, high tariff walls, and things like that. And so we know that there are going to be sort of high tariffs as a fixture of U.S. policy as long as Trump is in charge. But I think it's a more open question as to whether the next president would take a similar sort of omnidirectional approach to putting high reciprocal tariffs, so-called reciprocal tariffs, on virtually every country in the world. I think that is more unique to this administration.
Minister YEO, South Korea has to contend not only with its ally, the United States, but also with China. And when I say contend, I mean also do trade with, and to somehow find a way of working with both of these. Trade policy concerning these two great powers is intimately connected with security and politics. How are you working to strike a balance between trade, diplomacy, and security in relation to these two great powers?
Yes, I think it's a tough question. But the world has changed, and now we live in a world where these economic, commercial issues are intertwined with national security and all these issues. So I think that's the cold reality that we have to face. And when it comes to the G2 issue, I think Korea is, in terms of the trade portfolio, Korea is much more balanced right now than before. What I mean by that is that if you look at this for the last 20 years or so, the trend, the Korea's export to China was almost 2 times as high as we export to the United States. But for the last 3-4 years, that trend has begun to shift towards more balanced, way. So right now, last year, 2024, Korea's export to China was about 19.5% or so, and Korea's export to the U.S. was 18.7%. So it's coming very, very close. So that's due to the fact that Korea invests heavily in the U.S. and that investment bring in kind of import of intermediate goods, machinery, etc. from Korea to the U.S. So now I think we are much more balanced, terms in terms of trade. Because what we learned from all these trade war, etc., is that interdependence is inevitable, especially for a country like Korea. Korea's the trade ratio to GDP is almost 80-90%, actually one of the highest. If except for this European Union, it's one continent, so it's much easier to trade for European countries. But for a country like Korea, it's a very, very high level of open and trading, nation. So in this kind of for this kind of a trading nation, interdependence is inevitable, but overdependence is not good. Overdependence on one country or two countries, especially your kind of strategic security interests not perfectly aligned with a country, I think you could put your country in a very vulnerable position. So that's why I think as a trading nation, Korea needs to constantly recalibrate our trade portfolio, diversify, make new friends, and make ourselves less vulnerable to any one country. So in that sense, I think we are going in the right direction. And right now we are facing really unpredictable, uncertain trade environment. But I think this could be an also opportunity for us to pursue more this diversification strategy more in general.
I want to pick up on your word interdependence there, because that's what trade is very much about. In an ideal situation, both trading partners will benefit from that relationship, perhaps not equally, but in the larger context, there will be benefits accrued by both. Hal, the U.S. protectionist stance that it has now, the sanctions or tariffs that are being imposed on a lot of other countries, I want to ask you how that is impacting U.S. companies. This must be of significant interest to U.S. companies who rely on imports to develop their own products and services. How is that working out for the U.S.? Is this really in the U.S.'s best interest? We heard the minister at the very beginning asking the question with the decision to detain these Korean workers in Savannah, whether this is really in the best interest of the United States.
The short answer, in my view, is no. And I think that there is, and I'll just be very candid about this, a basic economic illiteracy at the heart of the president's approach to foreign trade. And so, the president will conduct these negotiations, and if the United States ends up paying a lower tariff for entry into another country's market than that country pays for entry into America's market, he counts that as a win, right? That is a manifestation of American power and negotiating prowess. It is also a tax on American consumers who are buying goods from abroad and American firms that are importing inputs or finished products from abroad. There is some question about what the ultimate economic impact of this will be. And we are only sort of starting to understand what the impact is, because we are only starting to see the effects of the tariff kind of filter through to consumers and to firms. And so, American firms and foreign firms are having to figure out, what part of the extra charge associated with the tariff are they going to eat? What part of it are they going to pass on to the consumer? Right? How is that going to affect inflation? How is that going to affect employment? I think the general answer is that it's not going to be good for the American economy in terms of generating sort of a more prosperous, more dynamic system. But the question of whether we're looking at sort of, economic apocalypse, as it looked like we were looking at in April when the stock markets and the bond markets were starting to freak out a little bit over the tariffs, or looking at something that is unhealthy but perhaps more manageable, I think we're still sort of coming to grips with the answer to that question.
I'm going to put one further question to the minister, and then I'm going to open the floor for some questions. So if you have questions, be thinking about them now, and I'll come to you in just a moment. Minister Yeo, what about the evolving relationship between Korea, the U.S., and Japan? Relations between Japan and Korea they've been fluctuating over the years. I've been coming to the World Knowledge Forum now. I think this is the 8th year, and it's been fascinating to always check in on that trading relationship because it is evolving as well. What kind of synergies do you see evolving in that tripartite relationship?
I think this trilateral relation between Korea, U.S., and Japan are very, very important right now, strategically aligned among these three countries. From U.S. perspective, this Asia Pacific is a very important strategic, battleground, right? And right now, but Korea and Japan are struggling with similar problem. I mean, the aging and shrinking populations. And although, we are competing in similar industry, but I think the supply chain between Korea and Japan are very well developed. And in this, from, the materials, parts, and, this higher end, this finished product. And also, if we combine the size of Korea and Japan, for example, GDP-wise, if we combine the size of Korea and Japan, it's the third largest in the world. And in terms of, let's say, the manufacturing capability, also if we combine Korea and Japan, it's the third largest in the world. Trade volume, fourth largest. So yes, if Korea, Japan is separate, then yeah, we can do just, okay. But if strategically the Korea and Japan are combined, economically. Also, right now, in terms of geopolitical purpose, if these two countries are combined, I think the two countries can exert more bigger influence on the global stage, and especially between this, competition between U.S. and China in this military sense, but as well as this trade and also the economic sense. So I think right now that's why President Lee this time made the first stop in Japan before he visited the United States. This is the first time ever for a Korean president to visit Japan ahead of the United States. So in that sense, I think the Korea and Japan, yes, we have some, we are close neighbors, so sometimes, we're going through up and down in the diplomatic relations. But I think it's time for us to look at big picture in a more strategic way and, constructive ways to work together with Japan.
Thank you. Super interesting. We can have a whole panel on that particular topic. I'd like to open the floor now to questions. I still have lots of questions myself, of course, but I would love to hear from the people in this room. We're looking at global trade, the global trading order, and we're looking at future prospects, where it might be going. We have the trade minister of Korea here on the stage, and we also have someone who understands the global network of how things work together, particularly how the economy and security work together. So if I see any hands, I will call upon you. Just raise your hand, and I think we have some microphones here that there's a gentleman there in the corner. Yes, sir. Just please identify yourself and direct your question.
Hi, I'm Ryan from Samsung Asset Management. We have formed a fund to invest in the U.S., and the U.S. mentioned that 90% of the profits will be retained. Was this part of the negotiation table? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the gentleman is talking about this kind of financing package that the Korea agreed with the U.S. On kind of providing about $350 billion, and this how that the profit could be kind of distributed, etc. And I think Japan had actually first and a similar deal structure with the U.S. With $550 billion, and last Friday the MOU between Japan and U.S. were widely reported in the news media. So right now, I think the Korean side is see this as a very, can I say, onerous terms for Korean side to accept, and still I think these detailed negotiations are on the way. So that's what I can say at this point. Thank you.
Hal, I want to bring you in here because we're looking, we're looking into the specifics of Korea's trading relationship with the United States and how these agreements are negotiated. I want to just broaden out the picture there because we're talking about the world trade order here, and we're looking also at the relationship between China and the United States, which is very fundamental and affects everything in between. So I wanted to ask you what sort of lessons the U.S. learned in its trading relations negotiations with China with respect to rare earths, when China has a grip on the access and particularly the processing of rare earths and minerals. And the United States, was it just not aware of that when it imposed these sanctions, recognizing that it could face that kind of retaliation? And what has it taught us about supply chains?
Yeah, the question of why the United States was so surprised by the impact of the Chinese rare earth export controls is an interesting one, because we sort of, observers have known for about 15 or 16 years since China imposed curbs on rare earth exports to Japan during a maritime dispute in the early 2010s, that this was a weapon that China was willing to wield. But I think that what sort of took American observers by surprise was the degree to which China had really sort of refined and sharpened the tool over the intervening period and turned it from sort of a blunt instrument that was hard to wield effectively to one where the government really had a better understanding of how the supply chain worked, that had a better view of how sort of the private sector landscape looked on this issue within China. And so it was able to be used with much more considerable effect. The related question is sort of why didn't the United States try to do anything about this dependency in the 15 years between 2010 and 2025? And the answer, I think, is just that it's kind of a hard problem. So rare earths are not particularly rare, but actually refining and processing them and getting them to market, it involves some pretty complicated processes. And it would probably require a multilateral solution to reducing dependence on China. And so this was one of these problems that I think everybody in the last administration and probably in the Trump 1 administration before that sort of understood was an issue, but it was like relatively far down on the list because it was so hard to deal with. The United States has finally gotten the required sense of urgency on this right now, but I think it's going to be a relatively long road to reducing dependency on China. The lesson from this, though, is fundamentally that economic coercion, technological coercion, is going to be a two-way street from here on out. China has been developing a whole suite of economic coercive tools. In many cases, it has learned from the United States. It has emulated a lot of the tools that the United States has used against China over the past 5 or 6 years. The U.S., of course, has used export controls quite aggressively in technological supply chains and with respect to semiconductors in particular. And so this is going to be much more of sort of a back and forth contest in coercion and counter-coercion in the years to come.
Minister Yeo, we've been talking a lot about steel and rare earths and shipbuilding, things you can, tangible things you can really put your fingers on. But there's also the digital market that needs to be talked about as well. It's calling for new global standards in trade and how to deal with digital products and services. Against that backdrop, what sort of strategy does South Korea have to foster growth in its own tech sector and relate to the global market in that sense?
Yes. For the last few years, unfortunately, Korea was not really visible in terms of this AI race on the global stage. But the new government right now is putting this AI growth strategy at the front and center of this economic growth strategy. And I think that we have a very good chance because Korea has a really great the digital infrastructure. This internet speed and all these the young talent pool, and also all these manufacturing the supply chain. So, for example, recently there was a big announcement of the SK and Amazon. They are building new AI data center in Ulsan. It starts with about 100 megawatt size, but eventually up to 1 gigawatt, which is enormous, size. And I think there's a really kind of the value proposition that Korea can provide, which is Korea has a lot of this the data accumulated in all this manufacturing. The Ulsan, the area where this data center will be built, is that has industrial clusters of automobile and chemical, machinery, and shipbuilding, etc. So I think that's sort of plenty of accumulated data in this manufacturing operation. That's what actually what Korea can offer, And with this combination of the manufacturing sector data accumulated in Korea and this breakthrough technology and the foundational technology of these American tech companies, if these two are combined, I think we can really change the game, And right now, I think this. I'm not an AI expert, but the Korean many experts see sort of a physical AI as a kind of niche area where Korea can really excel in this overall AI value chain. And I think in that sense, Korea has a good chance.
Minister Yeo, Hal Brands, thank you both very much. A warm round of applause for our speaker.